The laughter echoed through the aircraft hangar as Captain Marcus Webb pointed at the woman mopping the concrete floor. "Hey, cleaning lady," Webb shouted, his voice dripping with contempt. "You see that A-10 Thunderbolt over there? I bet you could fire it up real easy." The young pilots around him burst into raucous laughter, phones already ready to capture this viral moment. Laura Jackson, 45 years old, wearing a faded cleaning uniform, slowly straightened up. Her cold blue eyes showed no fear or anger. She simply nodded quietly. "Yes, sir." Webb grinned widely, thinking he was about to witness a spectacular comedy show. What he didn't know was that in 20 minutes, the roar of 2 TF-34 engines would shake the entire airbase. And when those engines thundered to life, everyone would understand just how wrong they had been about the woman holding a cleaning rag in her hands. The morning sun streamed through the massive hangar doors at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, casting long shadows across the pristine concrete floor. The scent of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid hung heavy in the air, mixing with the sharp smell of cleaning solvents. Laura had been working here for 3 months now, invisible to most of the flight crews who passed through daily. Her gray cleaning cart, loaded with supplies and equipment, sat parked near the maintenance bay where she had been scrubbing oil stains from the floor. Webb strutted closer, his flight suit crisp and perfectly pressed, his golden wings gleaming on his chest. At 28 years old, he carried himself with the cocky confidence of someone who had never truly been challenged. His crew cut was regulation perfect, and his aviator sunglasses hung from a lanyard around his neck. Behind him, 4 other pilots formed his usual entourage, each one eager to be part of whatever entertainment their leader was cooking up. "Come on, Webb," said Lieutenant Baker, a stocky pilot with a thick Boston accent. "Give the lady a break. She's just trying to do her job." But even as he spoke, Baker was fighting back a smirk, clearly expecting whatever was about to happen to be amusing. Webb waved him off dismissively. "Nah, this is educational. Everyone should know how these birds work, right?" He gestured grandly toward the A-10 Thunderbolt II that sat in the center of the hangar like a sleeping predator. The aircraft's distinctive twin engines and massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon gave it an unmistakable profile. This particular bird, tail number 87-0463, had recently returned from a training exercise and was scheduled for routine maintenance. Laura set down her mop and cleaning supplies with deliberate care, her movements precise and economical. She walked toward the A-10 without hesitation, her worn sneakers silent on the polished concrete. The pilots watched, expecting her to hesitate, to admit she had no idea what she was doing, to provide them with the entertainment they were seeking. "This should be good," muttered Lieutenant Chen, pulling out his phone to record. "She's probably going to ask which end is the front." Technical Sergeant Rodriguez looked up from his maintenance checklist at a nearby workstation. A veteran with 15 years of experience keeping A-10s flying, he had a weathered face and calloused hands that spoke of countless hours turning wrenches and troubleshooting complex systems. "Hey now, that aircraft's got live systems," he called out, genuine concern in his voice. "Ma'am, you might want to step back. These machines aren't toys." Webb spun around, irritated by the interruption. "Relax, Rodriguez. What's the worst that could happen? She pushes a few buttons and nothing works? It's not like she's actually going to get anything started." He turned back to Laura with a condescending smile. "Don't worry about him, sweetheart. You just go ahead and give it your best shot." Laura paused at the nose of the aircraft, running her eyes along its length with what appeared to be casual interest. But Rodriguez, watching more carefully than the others, noticed something unusual about her inspection. Most civilians looked at military aircraft with a mixture of awe and confusion. This woman was examining the A-10 with the systematic attention of someone conducting a pre-flight check. Captain Mills, the flight commander, emerged from the squadron operations office, drawn by the commotion. A serious man in his mid-30s with prematurely gray hair, Mills had a reputation for running a tight ship. He surveyed the scene with growing disapproval. "What's going on here, Webb?" "Just having a little fun, sir," Webb replied, his tone respectful but still carrying an undertone of amusement. "Thought I'd give our cleaning staff some hands-on aerospace education." Mills frowned. "This isn't a playground, Captain. That aircraft represents $12.8 million of taxpayer investment." He looked at Laura, who had begun walking around the A-10's perimeter. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the aircraft." But Laura didn't seem to hear him. She was crouched beside the landing gear, examining something that had caught her attention. When she stood, she held up a small metal object. "Safety pin was left in the gear," she said quietly, her voice barely audible across the hangar. Rodriguez's head snapped up from his checklist. "What did you say?" Laura walked over to him, extending the red safety pin. "Main landing gear. Someone forgot to remove it after the last flight." Rodriguez took the pin, examining it closely. His expression grew serious. "Holy cow," he breathed. "You're right. If we tried to retract gear with this in place..." He trailed off, the implications clear. A gear retraction with the safety pin installed could cause serious mechanical damage, potentially grounding the aircraft for weeks. "Lucky guess," Webb said, but his voice carried less conviction than before. Anyone could spot something that obvious. Laura had moved to the A-10's engine intake, peering inside with practiced attention. She circled to the port engine, then the starboard, her examination methodical and thorough. The pilots watched with growing curiosity as she completed what appeared to be a standard foreign object debris check. "Ma'am," Mills called again, his voice sharper now, "I need you to step away from that aircraft immediately." Laura straightened and turned to face the group of officers. "External inspection complete, sir. No foreign object debris detected. Aircraft appears ready for engine start." Her tone was calm, professional, almost military. The hangar fell silent except for the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional clank of tools from other work areas. Even Webb seemed momentarily at a loss for words. Baker was the first to recover. "Wait, hold on. Did she just say external inspection complete? Like she actually knows what she's doing?" "Of course not," Webb snapped, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "She's just repeating phrases she's heard around here, right?" He looked around at his fellow pilots, seeking confirmation that didn't come. Laura had opened one of the access panels on the A-10's fuselage and was examining something inside. Her movements were confident, purposeful. Rodriguez found himself walking over to see what had captured her attention. "Hydraulic fluid levels Ludia on the utility system," Laura observed, pointing to a specific gauge. "Within limits, but should be checked before next flight." Rodriguez stared at the gauge, then at Laura. "How did you... that gauge is buried behind 3 other components. Most people can't even find it, let alone read it correctly." "The utility system's critical for gear and flap operation," Laura replied matter-of-factly. "Standard pre-flight item." Chen lowered his phone, his expression puzzled. "Okay, this is getting weird. How does a cleaning lady know about hydraulic systems?" Webb's face was beginning to flush red. "She's just making lucky guesses. Or maybe she's been listening to maintenance briefings. That doesn't mean she can actually start an A-10. He stepped closer to Laura, his voice taking on a challenging edge. "Tell you what, cleaning lady, if you can actually get this bird running, I'll apologize publicly. But when you fail, you admit you're just a wannabe who doesn't know the first thing about military aviation." Laura looked at him for a long moment, her blue eyes unreadable. "Acceptable terms, Captain." Mills stepped forward. "Now, hold on just a minute. I'm not authorizing anyone to attempt engine start on this aircraft without proper credentials and authorization." "Oh, come on, Captain Mills," Webb said, his confidence returning. "What's she going to do? Actually get it running? It's impossible. She'll flip a few switches, nothing will happen, and we'll all have a good laugh. No harm done." Rodriguez was studying Laura more intently now. Something about her posture, the way she carried herself, was triggering a memory he couldn't quite place. "Ma'am, can I ask what your background is? You seem to know quite a bit about aircraft systems." "I clean buildings," Laura replied simply. "That's my job." But as she spoke, Rodriguez noticed the way she stood at attention while addressing the officers, her heels together, shoulders square. Military bearing was something that never completely left a person, and this woman displayed it despite her civilian clothes and humble occupation. Webb was growing impatient. "Look, we're wasting time here. She claims she can start an A-10. I say she can't. Let's settle this once and for all." He gestured toward the aircraft. "Go ahead, lady. Show us what you've got." Laura approached the A-10's cockpit, and Rodriguez found himself following, drawn by a mixture of curiosity and growing concern. Watching her climb the boarding ladder, he noticed the practiced ease with which she navigated the aircraft's exterior. Her hands found handholds automatically. Her feet stepped precisely on designated points. This wasn't someone learning as she went. This was someone following deeply ingrained procedures. The cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt II is a complex environment, packed with hundreds of switches, displays, and controls. Most civilians would be overwhelmed by the sheer number of options. Laura settled into the ejection seat and began adjusting its position with quick, efficient movements. Her hands moved across the cockpit, making minute adjustments to mirrors and displays, preparing the workspace exactly as a pilot would before flight. "Holy cow," Baker whispered, his phone now recording everything. "She actually looks like she belongs in there." Chen had climbed up to peer into the cockpit from the other side. "Webb, I think we might have underestimated our cleaning lady here." But Webb was committed to his course of action now. "She's just imitating what she's seen other pilots do. Watch. She'll start flipping random switches and nothing will happen." Laura's hands weren't moving randomly, though. Rodriguez, who had observed hundreds of engine starts from his position as crew chief, recognized the systematic approach of a trained pilot. She was conducting a preliminary cockpit check, verifying switch positions and reviewing emergency procedures. "Ma'am," Rodriguez called up to her, "before you attempt anything, I should probably mention that this aircraft has full fuel and a complete load of training ammunition. If something goes wrong—" "Understood, Sergeant," Laura replied without looking up from the instrument panel. "Emergency procedures reviewed and ready." The casual way she acknowledged his rank, the automatic military courtesy in her response, sent another chill of recognition through Rodriguez. But before he could pursue the thought further, Laura's hand moved to the auxiliary power unit start switch. Mills was reaching for his radio. "I need to contact base operations about this. We can't have unauthorized personnel operating military aircraft, even if they seem to know what they're doing." "Wait," Rodriguez said, holding up a hand. "Let me check something first." He pulled out his tablet computer and began accessing the base maintenance database. "Ma'am, can you tell me what engine start sequence you're planning to use?" Laura recited from memory. "APU start first. Allow 2 minutes for stabilization. Check electrical systems, hydraulics, and pneumatics. Engine start sequence port first, then starboard. Allow 30 seconds between engine starts for electrical load management. Monitor all engine parameters during run-up." Rodriguez stared at his tablet, then up at Laura. "That's word for word from the technical manual. Exactly right. No deviations." Webb's confidence was beginning to crack. "So, she memorized some procedures. That doesn't mean she can actually execute them." "Actually," Chen said slowly, "it kind of does. Those procedures aren't published anywhere public. You'd have to have access to classified technical manuals to know them, that precisely." Laura had continued her preparations while the others talked. Her pre-engine start checklist was proceeding smoothly, each action deliberate and purposeful. She activated the APU, and the small turbine engine in the aircraft's tail section began to spool up with its characteristic whining sound. "APU online," she announced, checking the generator frequency and voltage. "Electrical power stable." Baker shook his head in amazement. "I've been flying A-10s for 3 years, and I couldn't run through startup that smoothly without a checklist." The APU reached stable operation, providing electrical power and pneumatic pressure for the main engines. Laura continued through her checklist, verifying hydraulic pressures, checking flight control responses, and preparing for engine start. Every action was textbook correct. Rodriguez found himself caught between fascination and growing concern. This woman, whoever she really was, clearly had extensive knowledge of A-10 systems. But there were protocols to follow, chains of command to respect. "Ma'am, I really should insist that you identify yourself before we go any further. Operating military aircraft requires proper authorization." Laura's hands paused on the engine start panel. For the first time since this whole encounter began, she seemed to hesitate. When she spoke, her voice was quieter, more reflective. "Sergeant, have you ever had to do something you didn't want to do because it was the right thing to do?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications Rodriguez didn't fully understand. "Yes, ma'am, I suppose most of us have." "Good," Laura said simply. "Then you understand." Her hand moved to the port engine start switch. "Beginning engine start sequence." Mills grabbed his radio. "Base operations, this is Captain Mills at Hangar 7. We have a situation here that requires immediate attention." But his call was interrupted by the distinctive sound of a TF-34 turbofan engine beginning its start sequence. The port engine of the A-10 began to whine as the starter motor engaged, building toward the critical light-off point where fuel would be introduced and combustion would begin. Webb stared in disbelief as engine parameters appeared on Laura's displays, each reading exactly where it should be during a normal start. "This isn't possible," he muttered. "She can't actually be—" The engine reached light-off speed, fuel flow was established, and with a deep rumble that resonated through the hangar, the port TF-34 came to life. Exhaust temperature climbed steadily, but remained within normal limits. Oil pressure built to specification. The engine was running perfectly. Rodriguez checked his watch and began timing the interval between engine starts. 30 seconds later, exactly as Laura had specified, she initiated startup on the starboard engine. The second TF-34 spooled up with the same precision as the first, its parameters matching textbook values. The sound was magnificent and terrifying. 2 military turbofan engines at idle power filled the hangar with their distinctive roar, a sound that spoke of barely contained power and sophisticated engineering. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was alive, ready for whatever mission might be assigned. If this injustice makes your blood boil like it does ours, hit that like button and subscribe to support stories about quiet heroes like Laura who deserve our respect. Webb stared at the running aircraft, his mouth hanging open. Around him, other personnel were beginning to gather, drawn by the sound of engines and the obvious drama unfolding in Hangar 7. Maintenance crews, other pilots, support personnel, all of them staring at the impossible sight of their cleaning lady sitting in the cockpit of a fully operational A-10. Chen was the first to find his voice. "Webb, I think we owe this lady an apology." But Webb wasn't ready to admit defeat yet. "Lucky," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Pure luck. Any idiot can follow a checklist if they're careful enough." Laura's voice came over the intercom system, clear and professional. "Ground control, this is Warthog 0463, requesting taxi clearance for maintenance run." The radio response came immediately. 0463, negative taxi clearance. Identify pilot and authorization for this flight. Laura keyed the mic again. "Ground control, pilot identification, and authorization to follow. Request permission to taxi to maintenance run area for engine operational check." Rodriguez was frantically scrolling through database entries on his tablet. Something about Laura's voice, her radio procedure, was triggering stronger and stronger memories. There was a familiarity there that went beyond the past 3 months of watching her clean the hangar. Mills had managed to get through to base operations. "Sir, we have an unauthorized engine start in Hangar 7. The individual appears to have extensive knowledge of A-10 systems, but we haven't been able to verify their credentials." The response from base operations was immediate and concerned. "Captain Mills, shut down those engines immediately. We're dispatching security forces and the officer of the day." But even as Mills received those instructions, Laura was demonstrating that her knowledge extended far beyond simple engine starts. She began running through post-start checks with the systematic thoroughness of an experienced pilot. Flight controls moved through their full range of motion. Hydraulic pressures were verified. Electrical systems were tested and confirmed operational. "She's doing a complete operational check," Baker observed, his voice filled with awe. "I mean, complete. Everything by the book." Webb watched in growing dismay as Laura continued to demonstrate capabilities that no cleaning lady should possess. But he wasn't ready to give up yet. "Fine, so she knows some procedures. That doesn't mean she can actually fly the thing." As if she had heard him, Laura released the wheel brakes and began to taxi the A-10 forward. The massive aircraft moved with surprising grace, its engines providing just enough thrust to overcome inertia and set the 12-ton machine in motion. "Holy cow," Rodriguez breathed. "She's actually taxiing it." The sight was surreal. Through the cockpit canopy, they could see Laura in her faded cleaning uniform, aviator headset over her graying hair, maneuvering 8.4 million pounds of sophisticated military hardware with casual competence. Her taxi technique was flawless. Smooth control inputs, perfect tracking, appropriate speed control. Chen lowered his phone, his expression troubled. "Webb, this isn't funny anymore. Whoever this woman is, she's not just some cleaning lady. This is starting to look like espionage or sabotage or something." Mills was talking rapidly into his radio, coordinating with base security while trying to maintain visual contact with the taxiing A-10. "Unknown pilot is demonstrating extensive knowledge of SIR aircraft systems and procedures. Recommend treating this as a potential security incident." Rodriguez had continued his database search, and now he was staring at his screen in shock. "Guys," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think I know who she is." Webb spun around. "What? What are you talking about?" "The voice," Rodriguez said, his finger tracing across his tablet screen. "The radio procedures, the way she handles the aircraft." He looked up at the others, his face pale. "I've been trying to remember where I heard that voice before." Baker grabbed Rodriguez's arm. "Spit it out, man. Who is she?" Rodriguez turned his tablet around, displaying a military service record. The photograph showed a younger woman in Air Force blues, her blonde hair regulation short, her blue eyes sharp and confident. The name block read, Major Laura Jackson, A-10 Thunderbolt II pilot. "Ghost 7, Rodriguez whispered. The name hit the group like a physical blow. Ghost 7 was a legend in the A-10 community, a call sign that had become synonymous with impossible missions and miraculous survivals. But Ghost 7 had disappeared 3 years ago during a classified operation, presumed dead when her aircraft failed to return from a combat mission in Afghanistan. Webb stared at the photograph, then at the A-10 now making a perfect turn at the end of the hangar area. "That's impossible. Ghost 7 was killed in action." There was a memorial service. "Maybe," Rodriguez said quietly. "That's what they wanted everyone to think." The implications were staggering. If Laura Jackson really was Ghost 7, if she was alive and working as a cleaning lady on this very base, then there were layers to this situation that none of them had begun to understand. Mills had overheard enough of the conversation to realize the magnitude of what they were dealing with. "All units, stand down on security forces response," he said into his radio. "We may have a friendly personnel issue here, not a security threat." But his efforts at de-escalation came too late. 3 Air Force Security Forces vehicles were already racing across the flight line toward their location, their blue lights flashing. Behind them came a black sedan that could only belong to senior command staff. Laura, apparently oblivious to the approaching vehicles, had completed her taxi circuit and was returning to the hangar area. Her engine shutdown procedure was as flawless as everything else she had done, each step executed with textbook precision. The TF-34 engines wound down with gradually decreasing whines, their exhaust temperatures falling steadily until they reached acceptable limits for shutdown. As the engines spooled down to silence, the hangar seemed unnaturally quiet. The small crowd of personnel who had gathered to watch the unprecedented events stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had witnessed. Laura completed her post-shutdown checklist, secured the cockpit, and began to climb down from the aircraft. Her movements were unhurried, professional, as if nothing unusual had occurred. She had simply started an aircraft, conducted operational checks, and shut it down. Routine procedures, competently executed. Webb watched her descent with a mixture of awe and growing dread. If she really was Ghost 7, if she really was a decorated combat veteran and experienced A-10 pilot, then his behavior over the past months took on an entirely different character. He thought about all the times he had dismissed her, ignored her, treated her as invisible support staff. The sick feeling in his stomach was growing stronger. Rodriguez had continued his research, pulling up mission reports and service records. According to this, Major Jackson had over 800 combat hours in the A-10, 2 distinguished flying crosses, a Purple Heart, air medal with 15 oak leaf clusters. He looked up at the approaching figure of Laura Jackson. She's not just a pilot, she's one of the most decorated A-10 pilots in Air Force history. Baker was recording again, but his phone trembled in his hands. "Webb, we are so screwed." Chen nodded, his face ashen. "If even half of what Rodriguez just read is true, we've been completely disrespecting a genuine war hero for months." Webb said nothing. He couldn't speak. The magnitude of his mistake was beginning to dawn on him, and the implications were overwhelming. Career-ending, potentially. Life-changing, certainly. Laura had reached the ground and was walking calmly toward the group of pilots. Her expression was unreadable, her bearing military straight, despite her civilian clothes. When she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "Engines shut down, aircraft secured," she reported. "No discrepancies noted. Aircraft ready for normal operations." The security forces vehicle screeched to a halt outside the hangar, disgorging armed personnel who immediately began establishing a perimeter. The black sedan pulled up behind them, and Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander, emerged with purposeful strides. Colonel Hayes was a formidable woman in her late 40s, with steel gray hair and the bearing of someone who had climbed a senior rank through competence and determination. She surveyed the scene, the A-10 with its engines still ticking as they cooled, the gathered crowd of personnel, and the woman in cleaning clothes who stood at the center of it all. "Someone want to explain to me why I have reports of unauthorized aircraft operations in my hangar?" Colonel Hayes demanded. Mills stepped forward. "Ma'am, we have a situation that's somewhat difficult to explain. This civilian employee appears to have extensive knowledge of A-10 systems and procedures." Hayes looked at Laura, studying her face intently. Recognition flickered in her eyes. "Laura Jackson," she said quietly. "Ghost 7. Laura came to attention automatically. "Colonel?" "I should have known," Hayes said, shaking her head. "When the Inspector General told me they were sending someone to investigate safety culture issues at this base, I expected a man in a suit with a clipboard. I didn't expect one of the most decorated A-10 pilots in the Air Force to show up in Janitor's coveralls." The words hit the assembled group like a thunderbolt. Inspector General, investigation. Everything suddenly made sense, and at the same time, everything became infinitely more complicated. Webb felt his knees go weak. An IG investigation meant his career was over. Everything he had done, every casual insult, every dismissive comment, had been observed and documented by a federal investigator. He thought he might actually be sick. Rodriguez was connecting dots in his head, pieces of a puzzle falling into place. "That's why you knew about the safety pin. Why you spotted the hydraulic leak. You've been watching, evaluating, documenting everything." Laura nodded. "For the past 3 months. Safety culture, adherence to procedures, treatment of personnel." Her eyes moved to Webb. "Professional behavior and leadership effectiveness." Hayes turned to Mills. "Captain, I'm going to need a complete briefing on everything that happened here today, and I mean everything." Her voice carried the unmistakable tone of command. "Sergeant Rodriguez, prepare a detailed written statement about your observations." "Ma'am," Mills acknowledged, but his voice was strained. "Colonel, we had no idea." "That's rather the point of an undercover investigation, Captain," Hayes replied dryly. "Though I admit, Major Jackson's demonstration today was somewhat outside the scope of her original assignment." Baker found his voice. "Major, I thought she was—" He gestured helplessly at Laura's cleaning uniform. "Major Laura Jackson, retired," Hayes clarified, "recalled to active duty for this special assignment. Her cover as facility maintenance personnel allowed her access to all areas of the base while maintaining operational security." Webb finally managed to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "How long have you been watching us?" Laura looked at him directly for the first time since this whole encounter began. "Captain Webb, I've been observing your leadership style, your adherence to safety protocols, and your treatment of subordinates since my first day here. 12 weeks, 4 days, and approximately 6 hours. The precision of her answer drove home the thoroughness of her investigation. Webb realized that every careless comment, every safety shortcut, every moment of arrogance had been noted and evaluated by a trained investigator. Chen was staring at his phone. "Oh God, I've been recording this whole thing. This is going to be evidence, isn't it?" "Everything that happened here today will be part of my final report," Laura confirmed, "along with my observations of the past 3 months. Rodriguez had pulled up more service records on his tablet. "Major, according to this, you were involved in Operation Iron Thunder, the rescue mission that saved 200 civilians from Taliban forces." "That's classified information, Sergeant," Laura replied, but her tone was gentle rather than reproving. "Yes, ma'am. Sorry, ma'am." Rodriguez secured his tablet, but his expression remained awed. "It's just... that mission is legendary. They still teach it at the academy as an example of A-10 close air support capability." Hayes interrupted the conversation. "Major Jackson, while I appreciate the thoroughness of your investigation, I believe we need to discuss the parameters of your assignment. Demonstrating A-10 startup procedures wasn't exactly in your mission brief." Laura almost smiled. "No, ma'am. But Captain Webb's challenge provided an excellent opportunity to evaluate emergency response procedures, maintenance oversight protocols, and command decision-making under unexpected circumstances." Webb looked around desperately for any possible escape from the situation. "Colonel, I can explain. This was just meant to be harmless fun. I never intended any disrespect toward a fellow officer." "Captain Webb," Hayes said, her voice carrying ice-cold authority, "at what point during the past 3 months did you make any effort to learn about the background or qualifications of the personnel under your supervision?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Because the answer was obvious to everyone present, Webb had never made any such effort. He had made assumptions based on appearance and job title, dismissing Laura as irrelevant support staff not worth his attention. Baker stepped forward hesitantly. "Colonel, in Captain Webb's defense, none of us knew—" "Lieutenant Baker," Hayes cut him off sharply, "that's precisely the problem. None of you knew because none of you bothered to find out. You made assumptions about a person's worth based on their job assignment and your preconceived notions about who deserves your respect." Chen lowered his phone completely, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. "Colonel, we all participated. We all watched and laughed. We're all responsible." Hayes nodded grimly. "At least someone here is beginning to understand the gravity of the situation." She turned to Laura. "Major Jackson, I think we need to accelerate the timeline for your final report. This incident has provided more insight into the command climate issues you were sent to investigate than we could have hoped to gather through months of covert observation." Laura reached into her pocket and pulled out a small recording device. "I have audio documentation of everything that transpired here, Colonel. The device has been running continuously during my assignment." Webb felt the blood drain from his face. Everything had been recorded. Every insult, every dismissive comment, every moment of casual disrespect towards someone he had assumed was beneath his notice. The full scope of his professional misconduct was documented in excruciating detail. Rodriguez was shaking his head in amazement. "Major, the way you handled that aircraft, I've seen hundreds of A-10 startups, but that was textbook perfect. Better than textbook. You made it look effortless." 837 combat hours, Laura replied simply. "The muscle memory doesn't fade." Mills had been quiet, thinking through the implications. "Colonel, what happens now? To the investigation, I mean. And to—" He gestured vaguely toward Webb. Hayes considered her response carefully. "The investigation will proceed to completion. Major Jackson will compile her final report, including today's events. That report will be forwarded through appropriate channels for review and action." Her eyes found Webb. "As for individual consequences, that will depend on the specific findings and recommendations." Webb knew he should accept responsibility, should acknowledge his mistakes, and face whatever consequences were coming. But panic was setting in, and panic made him stupid. "Colonel, this whole thing was entrapment, setting up an elaborate deception to trap officers into saying things that could be taken out of context." The silence that followed his statement was deafening. Even his fellow pilots stared at him in disbelief. Hayes's voice, when she finally spoke, was deadly quiet. "Captain Webb, are you suggesting that your disrespectful treatment of what you believe to be a civilian employee was somehow justified by her actual identity?" Webb realized immediately that he had made things infinitely worse. "No, ma'am, that's not what I meant." "Then perhaps you could clarify exactly what you did mean," Hayes replied. "Because it sounded very much like you were arguing that disrespect is acceptable as long as the target doesn't have the rank or authority to hold you accountable." Laura watched the exchange with professional detachment. This was exactly the kind of leadership failure she had been sent to document. Webb's response to being caught revealed everything about his character and his fitness for command responsibility. Rodriguez had continued scrolling through service records, and now he looked up with an expression of profound respect. "Major Jackson, it says here you were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for single-handedly destroying 12 enemy positions while providing close air support for surrounded ground forces, and that was just one mission." "Sergeant Rodriguez," Laura said quietly, "those awards represent the efforts of entire teams. Pilots don't accomplish anything alone." "Yes, ma'am, but—" Rodriguez gestured toward the A-10. "What you just demonstrated, that level of skill and precision, that doesn't come from reading manuals. That comes from hundreds of hours of experience under the most demanding conditions possible." Baker was recording again, but now his focus was entirely different. "Major, would you be willing to talk about what it was like flying combat missions, for educational purposes, I mean?" Laura looked to Hayes, who nodded approval. "Combat flying is about precision, discipline, and teamwork," Laura began. "Every mission depends on careful planning, thorough preparation, and flawless execution. There's no room for carelessness or ego." Her words carried implicit criticism of everything Webb represented. Carelessness and ego had been defining characteristics of his leadership style, and everyone present understood the connection. Chen had put away his phone entirely and was listening intently. "Major, how do you maintain that level of precision under combat stress? I mean, when people are shooting at you and lives are on the line? Training, Laura replied simply. You train until procedures become instinctive, until correct responses happen automatically, even under extreme stress, and you never stop learning, never stop improving. Again, the implicit contrast with Webb's approach was clear. He had treated training as a necessary evil, procedures as optional guidelines, and learning as something that ended with initial qualification. Hayes had been observing the interaction with professional interest. Major Jackson, I think this impromptu educational session demonstrates exactly why your investigation was necessary. The difference between professional military bearing and casual arrogance is becoming quite apparent. Webb made one last desperate attempt to salvage his position. Colonel, I request the opportunity to provide context for my actions. This situation is being blown completely out of proportion. Captain Webb, Hayes replied, you'll have ample opportunity to provide your perspective during the formal investigation process. Right now, I'm more interested in understanding how this command climate developed and what systemic changes are needed to prevent similar incidents. Laura had moved closer to the A-10, running her hands along its wing surface with obvious affection. This aircraft represents something important, she said, her voice carrying a note of emotion for the first time. It represents the commitment of thousands of people, designers, engineers, maintainers, pilots, all working together to protect American forces and innocent civilians. Rodriguez nodded emphatically. Yes, ma'am. Every rivet, every system, every component represents someone's dedication to the mission. Exactly, Laura continued. When we treat any part of this organization with disrespect, when we fail to recognize the value of every person's contribution, we diminish the entire enterprise. The lesson was clear, and it was devastating. Webb's treatment of Laura hadn't just been personal rudeness. It had been a fundamental betrayal of military values and professional responsibility. Baker was struggling with his own guilt. Major, we all failed here, not just Captain Webb, all of us. We should have stopped this before it started. Lieutenant Baker, Laura replied, recognizing failure is the first step toward improvement. The military depends on people who can acknowledge mistakes and learn from them. Hayes checked her watch. Major Jackson, I think we need to move this discussion to a more appropriate venue. We have formal procedures to follow, and I suspect this incident is going to generate considerable interest at higher levels of command. Laura nodded. Yes, ma'am. I'll need to compile additional documentation about today's events and integrate them into my overall assessment. Webb watched helplessly as his career crumbled around him. Everything he had worked for, all his ambitions and plans, were dissolving in the face of his own arrogance and stupidity. The worst part was that he had no one to blame but himself. Chen approached Laura hesitantly. Major, I know this is probably inappropriate, but could I ask you something about the combat missions? Laura looked to Hayes again, receiving another nod of approval. What would you like to know, Lieutenant? How do you carry that responsibility, knowing that people's lives depend on your decisions and actions? The question was sincere, and Laura's response was thoughtful. You remember that it's not about you. It's about the people you are sworn to protect and the mission you're trained to accomplish. Personal ego has no place in that equation. The contrast with Webb's ego-driven leadership style couldn't have been more stark. His fellow pilots were beginning to understand just how far their attitudes and behaviors had drifted from professional military standards. Rodriguez had secured his tablet and was preparing to return to his maintenance duties. Major, will you be continuing your assignment here? I mean, now that your cover is blown? Laura looked at Hayes. That decision is above my pay grade, Sergeant. Hayes considered the question. I think Major Jackson's investigation has gathered sufficient data for analysis and recommendations. The events of today have provided a rather comprehensive case study in command climate issues. The implication was clear. Laura's undercover assignment was complete, and the real work, formal investigation, documentation, and corrective action, was about to begin. Webb made one final attempt to minimize the damage. Colonel, I want to formally apologize to Major Jackson for my inappropriate behavior. I understand now that my actions were unprofessional and disrespectful. Laura studied him for a moment before responding. Captain Webb, apologies are meaningful when they reflect genuine understanding and commitment to change. Time will tell whether your understanding is genuine or merely convenient. The response was devastating in its quiet professionalism. Laura wasn't rejecting his apology outright, but she was making clear that words alone weren't sufficient to address the depth of his professional failure. Hayes had heard enough. "Gentlemen, I want all of you to report to my office at 0800 tomorrow morning. We're going to have a very thorough discussion about professional behavior, military bearing, and respect for fellow service members." Her tone left no doubt that the discussion would be uncomfortable. Baker spoke for the group. "Yes, ma'am, we'll be there." "Major Jackson," Hayes continued, "I'll need your preliminary report by 1700 hours today. We need to brief higher headquarters on this situation as soon as possible." "Understood, Colonel," Laura replied. "The report will be complete and ready for your review." As the group began to disperse, Rodriguez lingered behind. "Major, can I ask you something personal?" Laura nodded. "Why did you take this assignment? I mean, you could have stayed retired, enjoyed civilian life. Why come back to deal with situations like this?" Laura looked at the A-10 one more time, her expression thoughtful. "Because the military matters, Sergeant. Because the values we're supposed to represent, honor, courage, commitment, they're worth defending, even when that means confronting uncomfortable truths about ourselves." Rodriguez nodded slowly. "Yes, ma'am, I understand." "I hope you do," Laura replied, "because you're going to be part of making things better. All of you are." The hangar was quieting down as personnel returned to their normal duties. The drama was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Webb stood alone, watching Laura walk away, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had lost through his own arrogance and disrespect. Chen approached him hesitantly. "Webb, we need to talk about what happened here, about what we're going to do going forward." Webb nodded numbly. There would be many conversations in the days to come, with investigators, with commanders, with his fellow officers. But the most important conversation would be the one he had with himself, examining how he had become the kind of leader who could treat a decorated war hero with casual disrespect simply because of her job assignment. Baker joined them, his expression serious. "This changes everything, doesn't it? Not just for Webb, but for all of us." "Yeah," Chen agreed. "We can't go back to the way things were, not after this." Webb finally found his voice. "No," he said quietly, "we can't. And we shouldn't." The three pilots stood together in the gradually emptying hangar, each lost in his own thoughts about professionalism, respect, and the heavy responsibility that came with wearing the uniform of the United States Air Force. The easy camaraderie of the past was gone, replaced by the sobering recognition that their behavior had fallen far short of the standards they were sworn to uphold. Outside, Laura Jackson was walking across the flight line toward the base operations building, her cleaning supplies forgotten in the dramatic events of the day. She had a report to write, commanders to brief, and recommendations to make about systemic changes needed to restore proper command climate. But first, she allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The truth was finally out, and the process of accountability could begin. It would be difficult and uncomfortable for everyone involved, but it was necessary. The military she had devoted her life to defending deserved better than the toxic environment she had documented over the past 3 months. The investigation was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The base operations building buzzed with unusual activity as word spread about the extraordinary events in Hangar 7. Laura Jackson made her way through corridors that had become familiar over the past 3 months. Though now, she walked with the bearing of the retired major she actually was, rather than the humble cleaning lady she had pretended to be. Colonel Hayes had preceded her to the building and was already coordinating with higher headquarters. Through the open door of the commander's office, Laura could hear fragments of a heated phone conversation about investigation protocols, media management, and damage control. "Sir, I understand the sensitivity of the situation," Hayes was saying into her secure phone. "But the investigation was authorized at the highest levels. Major Jackson was operating under direct orders from the Inspector General's office." Laura settled into a small conference room with her laptop and the recording equipment she had carried for the past 12 weeks. The weight of documentation was substantial, hundreds of hours of audio recordings, detailed written observations, photographs of safety violations, and comprehensive analysis of command climate issues throughout the base. As she began organizing her materials, Sergeant Rodriguez appeared in the doorway. "Ma'am, I hope I'm not interrupting. I wanted to ask if you needed any technical assistance with your report." Laura looked up from her computer. That's thoughtful, Sergeant. I could use some help correlating maintenance records with the safety incidents I've observed. Rodriguez entered the room and took a seat across from her. Ma'am, I have to ask, how bad is it? I mean, the investigation findings. Are we talking about individual disciplinary actions or something bigger? Laura considered her response carefully. Sergeant, what I've documented goes beyond individual behavior problems. There are systemic issues with safety culture, leadership accountability, and basic military professionalism that require institutional responses. I was afraid of that, Rodriguez said quietly. I've seen things over the past year that bothered me, but I didn't feel like I could speak up. Captain Webb has a way of making people who raise concerns disappear into undesirable assignments. Laura's fingers paused over her keyboard. Can you document specific instances of that retaliation? Yes, ma'am. Staff Sergeant Chen, different Chen from the pilot, raised questions about maintenance shortcuts last spring. Next thing you know, he's reassigned to night shift inventory duty. Airman Martinez reported a safety violation by one of Webb's friends. She ended up on permanent latrine cleaning detail. Laura was already creating a new file on her laptop. I need you to provide detailed written statements about those incidents, with specific dates and witnesses if possible. Absolutely, ma'am. There are probably 8 or 10 people who could provide similar information if they knew it was safe to come forward. It will be safe, Laura assured him. That's the point of this investigation, to create an environment where people can report problems without fear of retaliation. Rodriguez nodded, but his expression remained troubled. Ma'am, what happens to the good people who got caught up in this mess? I mean, Lieutenant Baker and Lieutenant Chen, the pilot Chen, they're not bad officers. They just got swept along by Webb's toxic leadership style. Laura had been considering the same question. That's part of what my report will address. The difference between leaders who create toxic environments and followers who enable them versus those who simply lack the courage or knowledge to resist. And which category do I fall into? Rodriguez asked quietly. Laura studied the maintenance sergeant's weathered face. Based on what I've observed, you fall into the category of good people trying to do their jobs under difficult circumstances. But that's for the formal review board to determine. Before Rodriguez could respond, Colonel Hayes entered the conference room with a stack of files and a grim expression. Major Jackson, I've just finished briefing General Morrison at Air Combat Command Headquarters. He's very interested in your preliminary findings. I imagine he would be, Laura replied. How interested? Interested enough to authorize a full command climate investigation, retroactive review of all disciplinary actions taken in the past 18 months, and immediate implementation of corrective measures. Hayes set down the files. He's also interested enough to personally review your final report before it goes to the Inspector General. Rodriguez stood to leave. I should get back to my duties, Colonel. Actually, Sergeant, stay, Hayes said. You're going to be part of the solution going forward. Major Jackson tells me you've been documenting some concerning patterns of behavior. Yes, ma'am. I've been keeping informal notes about things that didn't seem right. Hayes nodded approvingly. Good. That kind of attention to detail is exactly what we need more of around here. Laura opened one of her audio files and adjusted the volume for the others to hear. The sound of Captain Webb's voice filled the room. Hey, cleaning lady! You see that A-10 Thunderbolt over there? I bet you could fire it up real easy. The casual contempt in Webb's tone was even more apparent when heard in the stark environment of an official investigation. Hayes shook her head in disgust. How many similar recordings do you have? Hayes asked. Approximately 43 hours of direct interactions with Captain Webb and his immediate subordinates, Laura replied. An additional 87 hours of general observations about command climate and safety culture. Rodriguez whistled softly. That's a lot of evidence. It's a comprehensive documentation of systemic problems, Laura corrected. The individual incidents are symptoms of deeper issues with leadership accountability and professional standards. Hayes was reviewing one of Laura's preliminary reports. According to this, Captain Webb has been cutting corners on safety protocols for months. Abbreviated briefings, skipped checklist items, pressure on maintenance personnel to overlook discrepancies. That's correct, Laura confirmed. I've documented 17 separate instances of safety protocol violations, 12 examples of inappropriate pressure on subordinates, and numerous examples of unprofessional conduct. And his fellow pilots went along with this behavior? Laura pulled up another audio file. some more than others. Lieutenant Baker showed signs of discomfort with Webb's leadership style, but lacked the courage to challenge it directly. Lieutenant Chen, the pilot, seemed to genuinely admire Webb's cavalier approach. The enlisted personnel were clearly intimidated. Hayes made notes as Laura spoke. What about Captain Mills? As flight commander, he should have been providing oversight. Captain Mills was aware of some problems but failed to take decisive action. He preferred to avoid confrontation rather than address leadership deficiencies. Laura scrolled through her files. I have recordings of 3 separate conversations where Mills acknowledged concerns about Webb's behavior but decided not to pursue formal corrective action. Rodriguez had been listening with growing amazement. Ma'am, you recorded everything? I mean, literally everything? Laura nodded. The recording device was voice-activated and had a 72-hour battery life. I downloaded and archived all audio every evening. Did you catch that detail about the voice-activated recording system? Comment below if you think this level of surveillance was justified, or if you've ever had to document workplace misconduct in your own career. Hayes was now fully engaged with the investigation materials. Major Jackson, based on what you've documented here, we're looking at multiple violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, serious safety infractions, and a complete breakdown of command authority. That's my assessment as well, Laura agreed. The question now is how to implement corrective measures without destroying unit morale and operational capability. What do you recommend? Laura had been preparing for this question throughout her assignment. Immediate relief of Captain Webb from flight status and leadership positions. Comprehensive retraining for all pilots on safety protocols and professional behavior. Enhanced oversight from wing-level command. And most importantly, protection for personnel who come forward with information about past incidents. Rodriguez raised his hand tentatively. Ma'am, what about the maintenance side? I mean, we've been pressured to sign off on aircraft that weren't properly inspected. Laura opened another file. I've documented that pattern as well. Pressure from flight crews to expedite maintenance, shortcuts in inspection procedures, intimidation of maintenance personnel who raised concerns. Hayes's expression grew darker. How widespread is this problem? Systemic, Laura replied without hesitation. It involves multiple aircraft, multiple crews, and has been ongoing for at least 18 months based on the records I've reviewed. The magnitude of the investigation was becoming clear. This wasn't just about Captain Webb's inappropriate behavior toward a cleaning lady. This was about fundamental failures of military discipline, safety culture, and leadership accountability that threatened the operational readiness and safety of the entire unit. Hayes stood and walked to the window, staring out at the flight line where A-10 sat in their parking spots, looking peaceful and ready for whatever missions might be assigned. Major Jackson, in your professional opinion, how close did we come to a serious accident or loss of life? Laura considered the question carefully. Based on the safety violations I've documented, I would estimate that a serious incident was not only possible but probable within the next 6 to 12 months. The combination of inadequate maintenance oversight, abbreviated safety procedures, and poor crew coordination creates multiple opportunities for catastrophic failure. Rodriguez nodded grimly. We had 3 hard landings in the past month that probably should have been investigated more thoroughly, but Captain Webb insisted they were just aggressive pilot technique. Hard landings that weren't properly investigated, Hayes repeated, making notes. What else? 2 instances of pilots taking off with incomplete pre-flight inspections, Laura continued. 1 case of an aircraft being cleared for flight with a known hydraulic leak. Multiple examples of crew coordination failures that went unaddressed. The litany of safety failures was staggering. Hayes was beginning to understand why General Morrison had reacted so strongly to the preliminary briefing. The potential for catastrophic loss of aircraft and crew had been very real. A knock on the conference room door interrupted their discussion. Captain Mills entered, his face pale and his bearing noticeably more humble than it had been in the hangar. Colonel Hayes, you requested to see me? Captain Mills, sit down. We need to discuss your role in the command climate issues that Major Jackson has documented. Mills took a seat, his eyes darting nervously between Hayes and Laura. Ma'am, I want to emphasize that I had no knowledge of Major Jackson's true identity or mission. That's not what we're discussing, Hayes replied sharply. We're discussing your knowledge of safety violations, inappropriate behavior by subordinate officers, and your failure to take corrective action. Laura consulted her notes. Captain Mills, do you recall a conversation with Staff Sergeant Martinez on March 15th regarding concerns about maintenance procedures. Mills shifted uncomfortably. I may have spoken with Staff Sergeant Martinez about various issues. Laura played an audio file. Mills's voice filled the room. Martinez, I understand your concerns, but Captain Webb is an experienced pilot. He knows what he's doing. I don't want to create unnecessary friction over minor procedural issues. The recording was damning. Mills had not only been aware of problems, but had actively discouraged subordinates from pursuing legitimate safety concerns. Hayes leaned back in her chair. Captain Mills, explain to me how you justify describing safety violations as minor procedural issues. Mills struggled for a response. Colonel, I was trying to maintain unit cohesion. I thought I could address the issues through informal counseling rather than formal disciplinary action. And how did that work out? Hayes asked dryly. Obviously not well, Mills admitted. Laura had pulled up additional documentation. Captain Mills, I have records of 6 separate instances where you were informed of safety concerns and chose not to pursue formal investigation. In each case, you cited unit cohesion or morale as justification for inaction. I was trying to handle things at the lowest level possible, Mills said defensively. Hayes stood up. Captain Mills, handling things at the lowest level means correcting problems before they become systemic failures. It doesn't mean ignoring violations of federal regulations and military law. Mills realized that his position was becoming untenable. Colonel, I accept responsibility for my leadership failures. What I don't understand is why this investigation was necessary. Why couldn't these concerns have been brought to my attention through normal channels? Laura answered the question. Captain Mills, they were brought to your attention through normal channels, multiple times. Your consistent response was to discourage further action and protect Captain Webb from consequences. The audio recordings provided undeniable proof of Mills's pattern of enabling Webb's behavior. There was no plausible defense for his failures of leadership and oversight. Hayes checked her watch. Captain Mills, you're relieved of your duties as flight commander effective immediately. Report to Colonel Anderson in personnel for reassignment pending completion of this investigation. Mills stood slowly, the weight of his professional failure evident in his posture. Yes, ma'am. After Mills left, Hayes turned back to Laura and Rodriguez. How many other officers are we talking about? I need to know the scope of leadership changes that are going to be necessary. Laura consulted her comprehensive notes. Based on my observations, Captain Webb and Captain Mills require immediate relief from current duties. Lieutenant Baker shows potential for rehabilitation with proper mentoring and training. Lieutenant Chen requires significant counseling and close supervision. The enlisted personnel are primarily victims of poor leadership rather than perpetrators of misconduct. Rodriguez agreed with Laura's assessment. Ma'am, most of the maintenance crew are good people who were intimidated into cutting corners. Once they know it's safe to follow proper procedures, I think you'll see immediate improvement. What about flight operations? Can this unit continue its mission while we implement corrective measures? Laura had anticipated this question. Colonel, with proper leadership and restored emphasis on safety procedures, this unit can not only continue its mission, but perform at a higher level than it has in the past 18 months. Hayes was reviewing organizational charts and personnel files. I'm going to need recommendations for interim leadership positions. Who do you suggest for acting flight commander? Lieutenant Colonel Patterson from the wing staff has A-10 experience and a strong reputation for safety and professionalism, Laura suggested. Major Santos from the training squadron could serve as operations officer. Rodriguez added his perspective. Ma'am, from the maintenance side, Master Sergeant Williams has been trying to maintain proper standards despite the pressure from flight crews. He'd be an excellent choice for maintenance supervision. Hayes made notes about personnel recommendations. Major Jackson, I want you to expedite your final report. Based on what I've seen so far, we need to brief higher headquarters within 48 hours and begin implementing changes immediately. Understood, Colonel. I can have a comprehensive final report ready by tomorrow evening. Rodriguez looked between the two officers. Ma'am, what happens to people like me who witness problems but didn't do enough to stop them? Hayes considered the question. Sergeant Rodriguez, the investigation will evaluate everyone's actions within the context of the command climate that existed. People who were intimidated into silence will be treated differently from those who actively enabled misconduct. Laura added her perspective. Sergeant Rodriguez, your willingness to provide information now and your obvious commitment to proper procedures suggest that you're a part of the solution rather than part of the problem. Thank you, ma'am. I just want to do my job properly and keep people safe. That's exactly the attitude we need more of, Hayes replied. A secure phone in the conference room began ringing. Hayes answered it with crisp military bearing. Colonel Hayes? Laura could hear only one side of the conversation, but Hayes' expression grew increasingly serious as she listened. Yes, sir. Major Jackson is here now. Yes, sir. We have comprehensive documentation. Understood, sir. We'll be ready. Hayes hung up the phone and turned to Laura. General Morrison is flying here personally tomorrow morning to review your findings. He's bringing a team from the Inspector General's office and representatives from Air Combat Command headquarters. Laura nodded. I'll ensure all documentation is properly organized and ready for their review. There's more, Hayes continued. General Morrison has authorized immediate implementation of corrective measures. We don't need to wait for the completion of formal investigations to begin making changes. Rodriguez looked confused. What kind of changes, ma'am? Hayes consulted notes from her phone conversation. Immediate safety stand-down for all flight operations pending comprehensive review of procedures. Mandatory retraining for all pilots and maintenance personnel. Independent oversight of all safety-critical operations. And formal protection for any personnel who come forward with information about past incidents. Laura was impressed by the speed and scope of the response. That's exactly what's needed, Colonel. Swift, decisive action to restore proper military standards. The question now, Hayes said, is implementation. How do we make these changes without destroying unit morale and operational capability? Laura had given considerable thought to this challenge. Colonel, the key is transparency and accountability. People need to understand why changes are necessary, and they need to see that everyone is being held to the same standards. Rodriguez agreed. Ma'am, most of us want to do the right thing. We just need clear guidance and protection from retaliation. Hayes was taking notes as they spoke. Major Jackson, I want you to develop specific recommendations for implementation procedures. How do we communicate these changes to the unit? How do we ensure compliance? How do we measure progress? I'll include those recommendations in my final report, Laura promised. But the most important element is leadership commitment. People need to see that command is serious about these changes and that there will be real consequences for violations. Rodriguez raised another concern. Ma'am, what about the maintenance equipment we've been using? Some of it's been modified or used in ways that might not be strictly in accordance with technical manuals. Laura opened another file on her laptop. I've documented those issues as well. We'll need a comprehensive review of all maintenance procedures and equipment to ensure compliance with regulations. Hayes shook her head. The scope of this investigation just keeps expanding. How did we allow things to deteriorate this badly? Laura had analyzed this question throughout her assignment. Colonel, it's a gradual process. Small compromises lead to bigger compromises. Individual incidents get rationalized as acceptable exceptions. Over time, the exceptions become the norm. And nobody speaks up because they're afraid of being labeled as troublemakers, Rodriguez added. Exactly, Laura confirmed. The command climate becomes such that raising concerns is seen as disloyalty rather than professional responsibility. Hayes stood and walked to a whiteboard in the conference room. Let's start mapping out the implementation plan. What needs to happen first? Laura joined her at the whiteboard. Immediate safety review of all aircraft and equipment. Suspension of any operations that don't meet full regulatory compliance. Comprehensive briefing for all personnel about new standards and expectations. Rodriguez added his perspective. From the maintenance side, we need to inspect every aircraft thoroughly and document any discrepancies that were previously overlooked or minimized. Hayes began writing on the whiteboard. Timeline for implementation? Safety review within 72 hours, Laura suggested. Personnel briefings within 1 week. Comprehensive retraining program within 30 days. And long-term measures? Laura consulted her notes. Establishment of independent safety oversight, regular command climate assessments, enhanced training programs for leadership development, clear procedures for reporting safety concerns without fear of retaliation. Rodriguez was impressed by the scope of the proposed changes. Ma'am, this is going to completely transform how we operate. That's the point, Hayes replied. The current way of operating nearly resulted in catastrophic failures. We need fundamental change, not cosmetic adjustments. Laura's laptop chimed with an incoming secure email. Colonel, I'm receiving additional guidance from the Inspector General's office. She read the message, her expression growing more serious. They want me to expand the investigation to include all A-10 units at this base, not just Captain Webb's flight. Hayes considered the implications. How much additional work are we talking about? Substantial, Laura admitted. But if the problems we've identified are systemic, they may exist in other units as well. Rodriguez looked worried. Ma'am, that could ground the entire A-10 operation here. If that's what's necessary to ensure safety and regulatory compliance, then that's what will happen, Hayes replied firmly. Operational requirements don't override safety requirements. Laura was already developing a plan for the expanded investigation. I'll need access to maintenance records, flight operations databases, and personnel files for all A-10 units, plus interviews with key personnel from each squadron. You'll have whatever you need, Hayes promised. General Morrison has given this investigation the highest priority. A knock on the door interrupted their planning session. A young airman entered with a message for Colonel Hayes. Ma'am, Captain Webb is requesting to see you. He says it's urgent. Hayes considered the request. Where is he now? In the waiting area outside your office, ma'am. Hayes looked at Laura. Any objection to hearing what he has to say? Laura shook her head. It might provide useful insight into his mindset and willingness to accept responsibility. Bring him here, Hayes told the airman. A few minutes later, Captain Webb entered the conference room. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by obvious anxiety, and his military bearing had deteriorated noticeably. He looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept since the morning's events. Colonel Hayes, I need to speak with you about the situation. There are things you need to understand about the context of what happened. Hayes gestured to a chair. Sit down, Captain Webb. You have 5 minutes. Webb sat, but immediately leaned forward, his words coming in a rush. Colonel, I want to emphasize that I had no knowledge of Major Jackson's true identity or mission. If I had known she was an officer, my behavior would have been completely different. Laura and Hayes exchanged glances. Webb's statement revealed exactly the kind of thinking that had created the problem in the first place. Hayes leaned back in her chair. Captain Webb, explain to me why your behavior should depend on someone's rank or military status. Webb realized he had made a mistake but pressed on. Ma'am, I was treating her the way I thought was appropriate for civilian support staff. I never intended any disrespect toward a fellow officer. Laura spoke quietly. Captain Webb, what you're describing is a fundamental misunderstanding of military professionalism. Respectful treatment shouldn't depend on rank or status. It should be universal. But surely you understand that there are different standards for different people, Webb protested. I mean, officers have earned respect through their training and commissioning. Rodriguez was staring at Webb in amazement. Sir, are you saying that enlisted personnel and civilians don't deserve basic respect? Webb seemed genuinely confused by the question. Of course they deserve basic respect, but not the same level of deference that we show to superior officers. Hayes had heard enough. Captain Webb, what you're describing isn't military courtesy. It's elitist arrogance. The foundation of military professionalism is treating all people with dignity, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. Laura was making notes as Webb spoke. His comments were providing additional evidence of the deeper attitude problems that had created the toxic command climate. Webb seemed to realize that his explanation wasn't helping his case. Colonel, I'm willing to accept appropriate consequences for my actions, but I think the response to this incident is being blown completely out of proportion. Out of proportion? Hayes repeated. Captain Webb, you publicly humiliated someone you believed to be a vulnerable civilian employee. You encouraged others to participate in that humiliation. You treated another person as entertainment for your own amusement. It was meant to be harmless fun, Webb insisted. I never intended to cause real harm. Laura leaned forward. Captain Webb, impact matters more than intent. The fact that you didn't intend to cause harm doesn't erase the harm you actually caused. Rodriguez added his perspective. Sir, I've watched you treat people the same way for months. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was part of a pattern. Webb's face flushed red. Sergeant Rodriguez, I don't think you are qualified to evaluate my leadership style. And that attitude, Hayes said coldly, is exactly why you are facing disciplinary action. A good leader values input from all levels of the organization. Webb seemed to finally understand that he was making things worse with every word he spoke. Colonel, what do I need to do to salvage my career? I'm willing to accept counseling, additional training, whatever is necessary. Hayes considered the question. Captain Webb, the first step would be genuine acknowledgement of the scope of your misconduct. Not just the incident with Major Jackson, but the pattern of behavior that created a toxic command climate. I acknowledge that my leadership style may have been too aggressive, Webb offered hesitantly. Laura shook her head. That's not acknowledgement, Captain. That's minimization. Your behavior wasn't too aggressive. It was unprofessional, disrespectful, and potentially dangerous. Dangerous? Webb looked confused. Rodriguez explained. Sir, when you intimidate maintenance personnel into cutting corners, when you pressure people to overlook safety discrepancies, you create conditions for accidents and equipment failures. Laura pulled up specific examples from her documentation. Captain Webb, do you remember pressuring Staff Sergeant Chen to sign off on an aircraft with a known hydraulic leak? Webb shifted uncomfortably. That was a minor leak that was within acceptable parameters. According to the technical manual, any hydraulic leak requires investigation and repair before flight, Laura replied. There are no acceptable leaks in critical systems. Hayes was watching Webb's responses with professional interest. Captain Webb, do you understand why we can't allow officers to make independent decisions about which safety regulations to follow? I understand that safety is important, Webb said carefully. But I also understand that operational requirements sometimes require flexible interpretation of guidelines. Laura and Hayes exchanged another look. Webb still didn't grasp the fundamental principle that safety regulations weren't suggestions to be interpreted flexibly. Rodriguez tried a different approach. Sir, how would you feel if you knew that your family member was flying in an aircraft that had been cleared by someone who flexibly interpreted safety requirements? The question seemed to give Webb pause. That's different. I was making informed decisions based on experience and judgment. Were you, Laura asked, or were you making convenient decisions based on schedule pressure and a desire to avoid paperwork? Webb had no good answer for that question. Hayes stood up. Captain Webb, I've heard enough to understand your mindset. You're relieved of flight status effective immediately. You'll report to Colonel Anderson for administrative processing and await the results of the formal investigation. Webb's face went pale. Colonel, losing flight status could end my career. Isn't there some way to handle this through counseling or additional training? Your career concerns are secondary to flight safety and unit discipline, Hayes replied. You'll have an opportunity to present your case during the formal investigation process. Webb stood slowly, finally accepting that there was no easy way out of his situation. Yes, ma'am. After Webb left, the conference room was silent for several minutes. Rodriguez was the first to speak. Colonel, he still doesn't get it. He still thinks this is about being too aggressive rather than being fundamentally wrong. Laura nodded. That attitude is exactly why systemic change is necessary. Individual counseling won't fix institutional problems. Hayes was making notes about the conversation. Major Jackson, include Captain Webb's statements in your final report. They provide excellent insight into the mindset that created these problems. Already documented, Laura confirmed. Rodriguez checked his watch and realized how late it had gotten. Ma'am, I should probably check on the evening shift and make sure they understand the new safety emphasis. Good thinking, Hayes agreed. And Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you to personally brief Master Sergeant Williams on today's events. He needs to understand that he has my full support for enforcing proper procedures. Yes, ma'am. He'll be glad to hear that. After Rodriguez left, Hayes and Laura continued working on documentation and planning. The scope of the investigation and corrective actions was massive, but both women understood the importance of thorough, methodical implementation. Major Jackson, Hayes said, I want you to know that I appreciate the professionalism you've shown throughout this assignment. Going undercover for 3 months, enduring the kind of treatment you experienced, maintaining your cover while documenting everything, that required remarkable dedication. Laura looked up from her laptop. Colonel, I've spent my career defending the values that Captain Webb was violating. Honor, integrity, service before self. Those aren't just words on a wall. They're supposed to guide everything we do. They are now, Hayes promised. At least in this command. Laura's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. She read it quickly, her expression growing serious. Colonel, I'm receiving new guidance from the Inspector General's office. What now? Laura read from the message. They're expanding this investigation to include A-10 units at 3 other bases. Preliminary reports suggest that the problems we've identified here may be widespread throughout the A-10 community. Hayes sat down heavily. How widespread are we talking about? Potentially dozens of units, hundreds of aircraft, thousands of personnel. The magnitude of the problem was staggering. What had started as an investigation of one toxic officer had uncovered systemic issues that threatened the safety and effectiveness of an entire aircraft community. Hayes reached for her secure phone. "I need to brief General Morrison on this development immediately." While Hayes made her call, Laura continued organizing her documentation. The investigation that had begun 3 months ago with her assignment as an undercover cleaning lady was evolving into one of the most significant command climate investigations in Air Force history. Rodriguez returned with an expanded inspection device designed to better evaluate the current financial security protocols for aircraft certification systems. The advanced financial risk assessment technology BDITS had proven invaluable for military cost-benefit analysis, helping commands save millions of dollars annually through improved maintenance scheduling and resource allocation. "Ma'am, Master Sergeant Williams wants to meet with you tomorrow morning to discuss maintenance procedures. He says he has information about pressure from other units to expedite inspections." Laura wasn't surprised by this development. "Sergeant Rodriguez, I want you to document everything Master Sergeant Williams tells you. This investigation may be expanding beyond what any of us initially expected." Hayes finished her phone call and rejoined the conversation. "General Morrison is deploying investigative teams to all A-10 bases immediately. This has become a service-wide safety and discipline initiative." Rodriguez looked overwhelmed. "Ma'am, are we talking about grounding the entire A-10 fleet? If that's what it takes to ensure safety and restore proper discipline, then yes," Hayes replied without hesitation. Laura was already developing implementation plans for the expanded investigation. "Colonel, we're going to need additional personnel, expanded authority, and significant resources to handle an investigation of this scope." "You'll have whatever you need," Hayes promised. "General Morrison has declared this a Priority 1 initiative." The evening was growing late, but none of them felt ready to stop working. The momentum of the investigation was building, and each new piece of information revealed additional layers of problems that needed to be addressed. Laura's phone rang with another secure call. "Major Jackson?" The conversation was brief, but Laura's expression grew increasingly serious as she listened. "Understood, sir. Yes, sir, I'll be ready." She hung up and turned to Hayes and Rodriguez. "That was General Morrison. He's arriving at 0600 tomorrow morning with a full investigative team. He wants a comprehensive briefing on all findings by 0700. Hayes checked her watch. "That gives us about 8 hours to finalize everything." "I'll work through the night if necessary," Laura promised. Rodriguez stood up. "Ma'am, I should coordinate with the maintenance team to prepare for the General's visit. Do you need anything else from me tonight? Just make sure that all maintenance records for the past 18 months are available for review," Laura replied. "And Sergeant Rodriguez, thank you for your help today. Your willingness to provide honest information has been crucial." Rodriguez nodded. "Ma'am, I just want to see things done right. We've got good people here who deserve better leadership." After Rodriguez left, Hayes and Laura continued their preparation for the morning briefing. The documentation was extensive: audio recordings, written observations, safety violation reports, personnel statements, and comprehensive analysis of command climate issues. "Major Jackson," Hayes said, "I have to ask, was this assignment as difficult as I imagine it was?" Laura paused in her typing. "Colonel, listening to Captain Webb and his cronies treat people with casual cruelty for 3 months was challenging, but knowing that the documentation would lead to positive change made it worthwhile. How did you maintain your cover? I can't imagine having to act subservient when you're actually a decorated combat veteran." Laura almost smiled. "Colonel, I learned a long time ago that real strength doesn't require constant demonstration. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is wait for the right moment to act." Hayes was quiet for a moment. "And today was the right moment. Today was the perfect moment." Captain Webb provided a comprehensive demonstration of everything that was wrong with his leadership style in front of multiple witnesses with full audio documentation. "You manipulated the situation. I provided Captain Webb with an opportunity to demonstrate his true character," Laura corrected. "He chose how to respond to that opportunity." Hayes nodded slowly, and his response revealed everything we needed to know, plus everything we needed to document for corrective action. Laura's secure email chimed with another message from higher headquarters. She read it quickly, then looked up at Hayes. "Colonel, They want me to extend my assignment for an additional 6 months to oversee implementation of corrective measures. Hayes brightened. That's excellent news. Your experience and insight will be invaluable for the reform process. There's more, Laura continued reading. They're offering me a promotion to Lieutenant Colonel and assignment as the Air Force's first Director of Command Climate Assessment. Hayes was impressed. That's a significant position. You'd be responsible for preventing these kinds of problems throughout the service. Laura considered the offer. It would mean coming out of retirement permanently and taking on a completely new career field. It would also mean ensuring that future Captain Webbs are identified and corrected before they can create toxic environments, Hayes pointed out. Laura saved her work and leaned back in her chair. Colonel, 3 months ago, I was looking forward to a quiet retirement. Now I'm being offered the chance to help reform military culture at the institutional level. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that the military gave me everything. Training, purpose, the opportunity to serve something bigger than myself. Maybe it's time for me to give something back. Hayes smiled. I think the Air Force would be lucky to have you in that role. Laura made a note to respond positively to the assignment offer. I'll accept the position. Someone needs to ensure that the changes we're implementing here become permanent fixtures throughout the service. And someone needs to make sure that people like Sergeant Rodriguez and Master Sergeant Williams are protected and supported when they do the right thing, Hayes added. Exactly. Colonel Hayes accessed the specialized legal training portal on her laptop, utilizing the comprehensive online education system that had become essential for modern military officers. The professional development platform provided instant access to updated regulations, case studies, and certification programs that helped commanders stay current with evolving military justice requirements. The two women continued working through the night, preparing documentation and briefing materials for General Morrison's visit. The investigation that had begun as a simple command climate assessment had evolved into a comprehensive reform initiative with implications for the entire Air Force. As dawn approached, Laura felt a sense of satisfaction that she hadn't experienced since her combat flying days. She was once again serving a mission that mattered, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, and working to ensure that the military's values were more than just words on a wall. General Morrison arrived precisely at 0600 with a team of investigators, safety experts, and senior officers from Air Combat Command Headquarters. Colonel Hayes and Laura met them at base operations with comprehensive briefing materials and detailed implementation plans. The briefing took 3 hours. General Morrison listened intently as Laura presented her findings, asked pointed questions about specific incidents, and reviewed the audio documentation that provided undeniable evidence of systemic problems. When the briefing concluded, General Morrison stood and addressed the assembled team. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've heard this morning represents both a failure and an opportunity, a failure of leadership that allowed toxic behavior to flourish unchecked, an opportunity to demonstrate that the Air Force takes its values seriously and will act decisively to correct problems. He turned to Laura. Major Jackson, I'm promoting you to Lieutenant Colonel effective immediately and assigning you as my personal representative for this reform initiative. You'll have whatever authority and resources you need to implement comprehensive changes. Laura stood at attention. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. You've already proven that, General Morrison replied. Now I need you to help me prove that the Air Force is capable of meaningful change. Over the following weeks, the reform initiative expanded to include comprehensive reviews at 17 different bases. Captain Webb and 3 other officers were court-martialed for various violations of military law and regulation. Captain Mills and 6 other officers received formal letters of reprimand that effectively ended their military careers. But the most significant changes were positive. New procedures were implemented for reporting safety concerns without fear of retaliation. Leadership training programs were enhanced to emphasize respect for all personnel, regardless of rank or position. Independent oversight mechanisms were established to prevent future command climate problems. Lieutenant Baker and Lieutenant Chen both successfully completed enhanced training programs and went on to distinguished careers, having learned valuable lessons about the difference between true leadership and toxic authority. Sergeant Rodriguez was promoted to Technical Sergeant and selected for advanced leadership training. Master Sergeant Williams was appointed as the Wing's Senior Enlisted Advisor for Safety Culture, a new position created specifically to ensure that experienced enlisted personnel had direct access to senior leadership for reporting concerns. 6 months after the investigation began, Laura stood in the same hangar where Captain Webb had challenged her to start the A-10. But now, the hangar hummed with purposeful activity guided by mutual respect and professional competence. Safety violations had dropped to near zero. Morale surveys showed dramatic improvement. Most importantly, the unit was performing its mission at the highest levels of effectiveness and safety. Colonel Hayes, who had been promoted to General Hayes and assigned to head the Air Force's new Command Climate Assessment Division, joined Laura for a final walkthrough of the transformed facility. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, I have to say that this transformation exceeds even my most optimistic expectations. Laura watched as pilots and maintenance personnel worked together with obvious mutual respect and professional camaraderie. General, people want to do the right thing. They just need leadership that supports and encourages them. And protection from leaders who would exploit or intimidate them, Hayes added. Next week's story features a Marine drill instructor who thought the quiet recruit couldn't handle the pressure until classified orders revealed why she never broke under any amount of stress. Exactly. Laura's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. She read it quickly, her expression growing thoughtful. General, I'm being recalled to Washington for a new assignment. Hayes looked concerned. I hope that doesn't mean this program is losing its champion. Quite the opposite, Laura replied. They want me to brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff on expanding this reform initiative to all service branches. That's ambitious. That's necessary, Laura corrected. The problems we found here exist throughout the military, but so does the potential for positive change. Hayes extended her hand. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, it's been an honor serving with you. Laura shook her hand firmly. The honor was mine, General. As Laura walked toward the base operations building to catch her flight to Washington, her phone rang. The caller ID showed only a number, no name. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, Go 7, this is Control. We need to talk. Laura paused mid-stride. Control was the code name for her former handler in the classified operations world, a world she thought she had left behind. I'm in the Air Force reform business now, Control. My operational days are over. Are they? We have a situation that requires your specific skill set, international scope, classified level, and we need someone who can maintain cover while conducting sensitive investigation. Laura looked back at the hangar where the A-10 sat ready for their missions. How classified? Let's just say you'll need your old call sign again and pack for extended deployment. The line went dead, leaving Laura with a familiar mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Her reformation of military culture had caught the attention of people in very high places, and apparently her unique combination of combat experience, investigative skills, and ability to operate undercover was needed for something much bigger than command climate assessment. She thought about the quiet satisfaction of the past 6 months, the positive changes she had helped implement, the toxic leaders who had been held accountable, and the good people who had been empowered to do the right thing. But she also thought about the larger mission that had always driven her, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, ensuring that the military's values were more than empty rhetoric, serving something bigger than personal comfort or convenience. Her phone rang again. This time, it was General Morrison. Lieutenant Colonel Jackson, I've just received a very interesting call from some people who technically outrank me. They seem to think you're needed for a special assignment. Yes, sir. I've been contacted. I want you to know that whatever this assignment involves, you have my full support. The work you've done here has been exceptional, and I suspect your talents are needed for something equally important. Thank you, sir. But Jackson, Ghost 7, whoever they need you to be, remember that you've got people here who respect what you've accomplished and will support whatever comes next. Understood, sir. Laura ended the call and continued walking toward base operations, where a military transport was waiting to take her to a destination that would undoubtedly be revealed only after takeoff. Behind her, the A-10 Thunderbolt IIs sat ready for whatever missions might be assigned, maintained by people who had learned to take pride in doing things right, led by officers who had learned that true leadership meant serving others rather than exploiting them. The investigation that had started with a cleaning lady and a crude joke had ended with fundamental changes in military culture and the exposure of systemic problems that threatened operational safety and effectiveness. But for Lieutenant Colonel Laura Jackson, Ghost 7, it was also a beginning. The skills that had made her an exceptional combat pilot, a successful undercover investigator, and an effective agent of institutional change were apparently needed for a new mission, one that would once again require her to become someone else, to endure whatever challenges were necessary, and to serve the larger purpose that had always defined her life. As the transport aircraft lifted off from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Laura looked down at the facility that had been transformed from a center of toxic leadership to a model of professional military culture. The changes would be permanent, institutionalized through new procedures and ongoing oversight. The people she had worked with would continue the mission of constant improvement and mutual respect. But somewhere in the world, new challenges were waiting, new injustices that needed to be documented and corrected, new toxic leaders who thought their positions protected them from accountability, new good people who needed protection and empowerment to do the right thing. Laura Jackson had found her calling once again. Not as Ghost 7 the combat pilot, not as the decorated war hero, not even as the undercover investigator, but as someone who understood that real strength came from serving others, that true leadership meant empowering people rather than exploiting them, and that the most important battles were often fought not with weapons, but with courage, persistence, and an unshakable commitment to doing what was right. As she settled into the uncomfortable canvas seat of the military transport, Laura allowed her mind to drift back over the past 6 months. The transformation had been remarkable, not just in the unit she had helped reform, but in her own understanding of what it meant to serve. When she had first accepted the undercover assignment, she had viewed it as a final duty before permanent retirement, one last mission to close out a distinguished career. Instead, it had become a revelation about the true nature of leadership and the responsibility that came with experience and knowledge. Watching Captain Webb's toxic influence poison an entire unit had been painful, but witnessing the rapid transformation once proper leadership was restored had been profoundly inspiring. People truly did want to do the right thing when given the opportunity and protection to do so. Laura thought about Sergeant Rodriguez, whose quiet competence and moral courage had made him an invaluable ally throughout the investigation. He represented the backbone of the military, experienced professionals who understood their responsibilities and took pride in excellence. Under Webb's leadership, Rodriguez had been forced to choose between his principles and his career security. Under proper leadership, he had become a mentor and example for others. The transformation of Lieutenant Baker had been equally remarkable. Initially swept along by Webb's toxic charisma, Baker had possessed the moral foundation to recognize his mistakes and commit to genuine change. His evolution from follower to leader had demonstrated the difference between education and punishment, between development and destruction. Laura suspected that Baker would go on to become exactly the kind of officer the Air Force needed, someone who had learned from failure and emerged stronger. Even Lieutenant Chen, who had seemed most thoroughly corrupted by Webb's influence, had shown capacity for growth when given proper mentoring and clear expectations. The key had been patient instruction rather than harsh punishment, consistent standards rather than arbitrary rules, and most importantly, leaders who modeled the behavior they expected from others. Laura reflected on the hundreds of conversations she had overheard during her 3 months as a cleaning lady. Personnel who had been afraid to speak up, who had compromised their standards under pressure, who had gradually accepted declining expectations as normal. The transformation had been swift once they understood that doing the right thing would be supported rather than punished. Master Sergeant Williams had perhaps undergone the most dramatic change of all. A dedicated professional who had been slowly worn down by constant pressure to cut corners and overlook problems, he had emerged as a powerful advocate for safety and excellence, once given the authority and support to enforce proper standards. His promotion to senior enlisted advisor had sent a clear message throughout the wing that experience and integrity were valued over political maneuvering and expedient compliance. The aircraft encountered mild turbulence, and Laura shifted in her seat, her thoughts turning to the broader implications of what they had accomplished. The reform initiative had already spread to 17 bases, with more being added each month. The cultural changes they had implemented were becoming institutionalized through new procedures, enhanced training, and most importantly, a generation of leaders who had seen firsthand the difference between toxic and healthy command climates. General Hayes had been instrumental in ensuring that the reforms would outlast any individual leader or temporary policy shift. By embedding the changes into formal regulations and creating permanent oversight mechanisms, She had made it much more difficult for future web-style leaders to recreate toxic environments. The system was learning to protect itself from corruption. Laura considered the personal cost of her assignment. 3 months of enduring casual cruelty, dismissive treatment, and daily humiliation had taken an emotional toll that she was only beginning to acknowledge. There had been moments when maintaining her cover required her to accept treatment that violated every principle she had lived by as an officer and leader. But that temporary sacrifice had enabled permanent positive change for hundreds of people. The secure phone in her pocket buzzed with another encrypted message. Laura read it carefully, noting additional details about her new assignment. The scope was indeed international, involving military organizations from several allied nations. The problems they had identified in the U.S. Air Force apparently existed in military cultures worldwide, and there was growing recognition that reform efforts needed to be coordinated across national boundaries. Laura thought about the call from control and what it might mean for her future. Returning to the classified operations world would require her to once again assume false identities, endure difficult conditions, and work in isolation from normal support systems. But it would also provide the opportunity to address injustice and corruption on a scale that could affect thousands of military personnel across multiple nations. She reflected on the evolution of her own identity over the course of her career. From young pilot eager to prove herself in combat, to experienced officer focused on mission accomplishment, to undercover investigator willing to sacrifice personal dignity for institutional reform. Each phase had required different skills and different sacrifices, but all had been united by the common thread of service to something larger than personal ambition. The aircraft's engines changed pitch as they began their descent toward an intermediate stop. Laura looked out the small window at the landscape below, thinking about the people who lived in those houses and worked in those buildings. Somewhere among them were future military recruits who would depend on the reforms she had helped implement to ensure they served in organizations that valued their contributions and protected their welfare. The memory of her final conversation with Rodriguez came back to her. He had asked whether the investigation had been worth the personal cost, whether enduring months of disrespect had been justified by the eventual outcome. Laura had told him that individual sacrifice was meaningful only when it served a larger purpose, when it protected others or prevented greater harm. Now, flying toward an unknown destination and another challenging assignment, Laura felt the truth of that statement more deeply than ever. The military had given her everything: training, purpose, the opportunity to serve her country and protect others, the chance to give something back, to use her unique combination of skills and experience to prevent future injustices, was not just an opportunity, but an obligation. Laura thought about the young airmen and soldiers who were just beginning their careers, who would serve under leaders shaped by the reforms she had helped implement. They would never know her name or understand the connection between their positive experiences and the sacrifices made by someone they would never meet. That anonymity was part of the mission, part of what made the service meaningful. The aircraft banked toward the east, carrying her toward whatever new mission awaited. Behind her, the A-10 Thunderbolt IIs continued their vigilant watch, ready to respond to threats and protect those who needed protection. The hangars that had once echoed with toxic laughter and casual cruelty now hummed with the productive energy of professionals who took pride in excellence and mutual respect. Ahead lay uncertainty, challenge, and the opportunity to once again make a difference in ways that would never be publicly acknowledged, but would matter to the people whose lives would be touched by her service. The transformation she had witnessed over the past 6 months had proven that change was possible, that toxic cultures could be reformed, and that individual actions could have far-reaching positive consequences. Lieutenant Colonel Laura Jackson closed her eyes and allowed herself to rest during the flight, knowing that whatever came next would require every ounce of skill, experience, and determination she had developed over a career dedicated to serving something bigger than herself. The quiet woman who had endured 3 months of casual cruelty and disrespect was ready to become whoever she needed to be for the next mission. The engines of the transport aircraft hummed steadily as they carried her toward a new chapter in a life dedicated to justice, accountability, and the protection of those who served their country with honor. The transformation was complete, but the mission continued.
The stories end here, but the journey continues. Many new episodes are waiting for you. And if you enjoy, Please take a moment to like, subscribe to our EV Story channel and turn on the bell. See you in the next story.